I'm very pleased to be here today for our second session focusing on social emotional development and collaborative learning in the early years. As you all may know, First Five Commission here in San Mateo and really throughout California are working in partnership with you and with local organizations and agencies to try to address the comprehensive needs of our very young children, 0 to 5, in the areas of health, early learning, and family support. And if you remember, one of the things we talked about at great length last time was the importance of that warm handoff as we send our young children from preschool and pre-K to kindergarten and then to the elementary grades. How important it is that we do it, that we get it right, so that teachers and everyone working with those children can understand their academic challenges and their strengths. That same warm handoff is just as important for the social and emotional aspects of a child too. You know, everywhere you look and see and hear, there's so much emphasis now on early learning and what's best for our young children. We have tremendous opportunities to provide high quality preschool experiences and implement the Common Core standards. But we always have to keep in mind that learning happens in a context. It happens when children feel safe, when they feel cared for, where they have strong, supportive relationships with their caregivers and other adults around them. We know that the ability for a young child to regulate their emotions, their behavior, their attention is a crucial component of eventual success in school and socially throughout all their lives. That self-regulation, that executive function in the early years has been shown to predict academic achievement and more positive interpersonal relationships. And the foundations of that self-regulation really are established in the context of the parent-infant, parent-child relationship. Some of First Five's funded programs and investments that we are very proud of in our community, such as Star Vista's Healthy Homes, Early Mental Health Consultation, the Learning Together program, our county family health services prenatal to 3, and Envision Shelter Networks, supportive work with children from families who are homeless. All of this focuses on supporting our families and our young children with social and emotional and behavioral issues, poverty, neglect, and many other risk factors. You know, at our office this week, one of the staff was commenting. She had been out at one of the family shelter sites doing some parent training. And she was commenting the overwhelmingly positive response of the evaluations from the parents and the caregivers. And we were just talking about that in the office, and it doesn't surprise me because Karen is a very good presenter, but it reminded me and reminded us as we were talking how hungry parents and adults are for skills, for knowledge. What is the best thing to do with my baby? I mean, one woman had her child in a car. So for those families, it's even more crucial to have knowledge and skills about what to do so that their children can grow up well and healthy. We know how important it is. It's crucial that that happens. And, you know, looking at some of these words up here, for me, this would be huge. We are very grateful to be able to be doing this work right now and to have such an impact. We are very fortunate today to have with us Dr. Ross Thompson, a distinguished professor at UC Davis, to speak about social foundations of early learning. His preschool learning foundations and frameworks, as Jessica mentioned in one of the books I know is floating around here, they're on the back table, and I think they're going to be used later on in some of the teamwork that you'll be doing. Dr. Thompson is a distinguished professor of psychology at the University of California, Davis. He studies early parent-child relationships, the development of emotion understanding and emotion regulation, conscience development, and the growth of self-understanding in young children. He also works on the applications of developmental research to public policy concerns, including school readiness and its development, early childhood investments, and early mental health. He was a member of the National Research Council Committee that produced the report From Neurons to Neighborhoods, and is currently serving on another committee of the Council on the science of children from birth to age 8. He received the Anne Brown Award for Excellence in Developmental Research in 2007, and the University of California, Davis Distinguished Scholarly Public Service Award in 2011. So let's please welcome Dr. Thompson.
Thank you for those very kind comments. I want to thank you all for being here, and I want to thank you for the good work that you're doing. My wife, Janet, is the director of the UC Davis Early Childhood Lab School, and one of the pleasures we have is collaborating on projects like the Preschool Learning Foundations and the Curricular frameworks, and I just want to point that out so that if you hear anything of practical value to the work that you do today, you can attribute that to Janet. I'm the researcher. She's the one who makes it real in the lives of kids. But also someone who makes this real in my own experience is a 6-year-old named Emma, whose mother we befriended at our church when she was going through a tough time. And Janet and I have been surrogate grandparents to Emma virtually since her birth. And we have watched her grow up, and we have also watched the remarkable effects of the investments that others have made in her learning and in her development. At age 6 now, Emma is a first grader, and it's amazing to watch how much she has got game as it relates to learning in a classroom. She loves doing math problems, and she's really good at it. She struggles with reading, and she's getting help in improving her skills in that area. But most of all, we're seeing the ways in which this explosive brain development that has been going on for some time in her and is continuing is manifesting itself through the nurturance of the relationships that she has developed with teachers all along the way to make her now a really, really outstanding learner. And of course, she's right in the middle of the transitional period that we're talking about now, pre-K through grade 3. And we're looking forward to seeing all the other developments that are coming up in the months and years to come for her. So here's the question that interests us, that concerns us, that motivates us, that captivates us. What do young children need to succeed at school? And what makes this an absolutely historic moment, a time that people are going to be writing about and talking about in generations to come, is the fact that you and I are not alone in asking this question. This is a question that many people in society are thinking about, are worrying about, are pondering, and policymakers are beginning to consider. How do we go about providing things that young children need to learn? As just one example of that, you may be familiar with the book How Children Learn by Paul Tough, a New York Times journalist, who has put together a lot of the research looking at both the cognitive and the non-cognitive or social and emotional characteristics of going to children's success in school. And Tough is just one of many, many people in our broader society who are asking this question: what do young children need to succeed in school? Perhaps more pertinently to us, and I certainly want to flag this for you, is that there is also, as was mentioned just a moment ago, a new committee, a blue ribbon committee appointed by the National Research Council, the Institute of Medicine, that has been commissioned to write and to produce a report within the next year on the science of children from birth to age 8, deepening and broadening the foundation for success. How many of you are familiar with the book From Neurons to Neighborhoods? Okay, more of you should be. The book came out in 2000. It was a groundbreaking book in terms of its influence in our understanding of how children grow across all dimensions from birth to age 5. And it was part of what helped to bring the brain development news to broader attention with its implications for policy and practice. This committee has been asked to write the successor to Neurons to Neighborhoods, to be able to talk now about how children learn and grow, not from birth to 5, but from birth to 8, with a particular focus on what are the implications of this for workforce development. In other words, for the preparation, the training, and the support of people like those who are in this room, like you and me. And so I urge you to look for this. I am on that committee. I'm actually the only one of the Neurons to Neighborhoods panel that has come back for this one as well. And we are working our butts off to create something that will have comparable impact, but most of all, will be important to you. Now, we're working today in the context, among other things, also of the Common Core standards, another important reflection of our society's growing commitment to preparing children to learn and to be successful in school. Thank you. Although the Common Core focuses at this point on the development of literary skills and mathematics, one of the things that we begin with is our realization that school success requires much more than just literacy and number skills, doesn't it? It requires much more in at least two ways. First of all, it requires a broader diversity of cognitive skills. To succeed in school, children need to develop skills in memory, in comprehension, in numerical reasoning, in causal reasoning, in problem solving, classification, and logical inference, just to name some of the skills that you are helping to develop in children in the classroom. But equally importantly, and this should not be lost, what school success requires is the development of learning skills, what some people call non-cognitive skills. I don't like that term because it describes what they're not. But what these are the learning skills that enable children to develop those cognitive skills. And among those is a capacity for focused attention, for persistence, for curiosity, for executive function, which was mentioned a moment ago and which we're going to talk about more this morning, which has implications for emotion regulation, self-confidence, and social competence. Learning occurs in a social setting. And that's not just because of the convenience of teaching kids and having them interact in groups. It is because, and this is one of the important themes for this morning, relationships help children use and extend the skills they're developing. Relationships help children use and extend the skills they're developing. And so relationships aren't optional. They're absolutely core and essential, and that's especially true in early development as children are going through the pre-K to kindergarten and third grade transition. All these cognitive and learning skills are rooted in the developing brain, and that brain development is, as it is in Emma, utterly transforming what children are like as learners during this period. Now, some of us come from working with preschoolers and kids in the pre-K environment. Others of us work more in the grade school world. And it's very important to see how much children are changing in the nature of who they are as learners as they're going through this transitional period that interests us. Consider, for example, that where preschoolers and pre-K kids are concerned, they really need support for managing their attention, their thinking, their feelings. As we'll see in a moment, it's not their fault. Their brains are simply not as skilled at that self-regulation. So in a room like this, a preschooler's attention naturally drifts off to, I could not be a student here with vistas like this to look at, but I certainly would not be paying attention if I was a preschooler. By contrast, grade schoolers, as we're moving into 4th, 5th, and 6th grade, they are much more self-regulated learners. You can give them an assignment and pretty much expect that they'll be able to do it most of the time. Okay. Another important transition in children as learners is that younger children, preschoolers and pre-K, these are kids who learn by doing. These are kids who are actively involved in the actions and the experiences that feed their developing minds. That is also true for grade schoolers. But of course, as children get older, they are also more capable of learning by instruction, of learning by what you tell them and thinking it through in the mind rather than acting it out in their behavior. Another very important transition for kids is that in the early years, the pre-K years, children are learning through collaboration. That social interaction is, again, not optional, but absolutely essential as children are stimulating each other, provoking their minds, as teachers are providing those catalysts. When a child says, how does that work? And a wise preschool teacher, rather than explaining to them, says, well, let's find out. And together, in a relationship, they figure things out. Well, that's also true for kids in grade school. But the capacity that their developing brains also provide is the ability to learn individually, to figure things out themselves. And as Emma is showing us, that can be wonderfully exciting. Child initiative is so essential when we're thinking about how young children learn. The whole idea of emergent curriculum, as many of you know, is the idea that a skilled teacher capitalizes on what has captured a child's curiosity, extends that into a learning opportunity. That, too, is a fantastic teaching technique as children move through the pre-K, through the grade school years. But increasingly, their learning is also guided by teacher initiative, namely a curriculum that teachers have instituted as developmentally appropriate to guide children in the development of these skills. This is one of my favorite contrasts. Preschoolers and pre-K children's learning is intuitive and experiential. It is based on what they're putting together through their own intuitions. Like the child who was in a group where Janet had brought out an airplane and asked children if any of them knew what this was. And Josh, sitting in the front, said, "Well, that's a hairplane." And Janet, as a good teacher, picked up on that and said, "Well, that's very interesting. Why is it called a hairplane, Josh?" And he knew exactly why. He said, "Because it flies in the air where your hair is." You can't beat that kind of intuitive learning. But what changes as children move into the grade school years is that children become metacognitive. They become self-aware learners, and they become preoccupied with that game of thinking, that excitement of figuring things out and being aware of your doing so. And finally, younger children are easily distracted or deterred. Persistence is something that requires relational support. By contrast, brain development provides a self-regulation to enable children as they move into the grade school years to become more self-regulated learners and to show greater persistence. The important idea here then is that if we think of the three ingredients that are contributing to children's school success, the development of the brain, the growth of early learning and academic success, and social emotional competence, these are deeply connected with each other. And the foundation that we provide early in life creates the building blocks for the learning that children and learning skills that children will be exhibiting and demonstrating and using as they get older. And that's really our conversation this morning. So to return to our question, how do we help young children become successful learners? Boy, we could spend a whole day on this, but let me just highlight three things we can do. One is to assist in their self-regulation, because self-regulation, these executive function skills, are so important to their ability to benefit from what we can provide them with in a classroom. And our relationships can help them use and extend these developing executive functions. We can help to promote cooperative social skills because children in this developmental period are right in the midst of acquiring many of the skills that enable them to become cooperative and responsible classroom learners. And then finally, we have to recognize that a lot of kids in our classrooms are facing stress. From home, from neighborhoods, from other elements of their lives. One of the things we can do is to aid in their coping with stress. And one of the themes uniting all three of these topics is that the quality of children's relationships with teachers and peers is important to their school success. It helps children use and to extend their developmental skills. So let's begin talking about self-regulation. And in our field, you probably know, the term that we use to describe the core elements of self-regulation are executive functions. And indeed, the development of executive functions can be found in the most sophisticated regions of the brain. Now, what are executive functions? We can define them as a set of cognitive processes that enable self-regulated, goal-directed thought and behavior. That's a mouthful. An easier way to think about them is that executive functions are like the air traffic controller of our minds. Do we need air traffic controllers to guide our thinking? You bet we do. We need an air traffic controller to focus on what I'm supposed to be listening to this morning rather than letting my thoughts drift off to what my plans are this afternoon or this weekend. We need an air traffic controller to enable us to multitask. I see some of you texting as you're listening to me today. You're good at multitasking. We need an air traffic controller to help us organize the multiple things going on in our mind at the same time. We're often not aware of that air traffic controller because we've been using it for years, but children are developing that skill. What I want to do is to show you a little video clip that describes some of the research that is relating to the development of executive functions. This is put together, and I contributed to it at the time that I was affiliated with the Harvard Center on the Developing Child. In fact, some of my colleagues are featured here. It'll give us a roadmap for how to think about this development.
Science tells us that brains, minds, are built, not born. And at the center of this dynamic architecture are a set of skills called executive function and self-regulation.
Children's self-regulation and executive function are key ingredients in their lifetime performance. It's not just about learning language or learning numbers or learning colors.
We have to be able to work effectively with others, with distractions, with multiple demands. These actually are skills that contribute to the productivity of the American workforce.
Just look at your shapes. What should you have done next?
Educators, I think, are looking for just this sort of thing. And when we describe what we mean by executive function, they say, yes, that's it. That's exactly, the problem. These kids, they can tell me these rules, but they can't actually use them.
What's this? A toolbox. A toolbox.
What is executive function?
Safety goggles. Safety goggles.
Probably the best way to think about it is sort of like an air traffic control system in the brain. Just like an air traffic control system has to manage lots of airplanes going on lots of runways and really exquisite timing and so on, a child has to manage a lot of information and avoid distractions. We really think of it as involving working memory and inhibitory control and mental flexibility. Take a situation where a child is having to take turns. So first of all, the child has to have inhibitory control. The child has to be able to stop whatever he or she is doing and let the other child take a turn.
Cute.
But when it's your turn again, you also have to remember what it is you're supposed to be doing. So that pulls on working memory. If the children who are taking the turns after you do something unpredictable, you have to be able to adjust what you're going to do next. And that requires mental flexibility. Children who are struggling with these capacities often look like children who just aren't paying attention, or children who are deliberately not controlling themselves.
If you don't have self-regulation, you act out and the teacher puts you in timeout, and so then you miss part of the learning that's going on, and then you are more upset because you're behind, and so you act out, and so you get this downward spiral.
How does executive function develop?
7. And plus 4.
In little children, and even in the infant and toddler years, you begin to see the roots of executive functioning skills. What's going on in our brains is unbelievably intricate and complicated.
The prefrontal cortex, or the front third of the brain, is important for executive function. But it's more than just prefrontal cortex. This region doesn't act alone. It's involved in controlling your behavior through its interactions with all other parts of the brain. The brain goes from a situation where you've got nearest neurons communicating very strongly with each other and ignoring the rest of the brain, to these widespread networks that are connecting these different areas. Executive function changes over the life course. It improves radically over the first few years.
I got a match prime.
It continues to improve throughout adolescence. It's not until early adulthood that you have the adult-type networks that are very strongly activated that connect different brain regions together.
Let's take notes.
Also, we believe that executive functions can be trained.
It's just like going to the gym. So the more you practice in these areas, the stronger the capacity is likely to become, because you're hoping to strengthen those neural connections.
You're at 24.
slowly but surely you're going to be able to step back, and that child's going to go into the world with these skills where they can get along with other people, change rules, and they can be flexible, and they can accomplish new things, and they're unafraid.
I got bit by my dog in my arm. Oh dear.
If we don't learn these skills during the childhood and adolescent years when they're coming online, we are really ill-equipped as an adult to hold a job, to maintain a marriage, to raise children, to get along with each other, to basically be part of a civil society.
You're okay.
Executive functions are important for us to understand because oftentimes the behaviors that they govern are behaviors that we often see children and interpret their actions as being egocentric or defiant, without recognizing that what we're looking at is a brain that is just developing the capacity for self-regulation. And oftentimes children are as surprised as we are that they forget what to do when they are asked to do it, or that they get lost in the middle of making a transition, or that they lose control of their emotions when they're provoked. So let me just remind you as a bit of review. Executive functions consist of three things. Inhibitory control, the ability to resist a strong inclination to do one thing and instead do what is most appropriate or needed, is a skill that is painstakingly being developed in this pre-K to third grade transition. What we do with kids can help them use this developing skill and extend it. And of course, it has to do with things like staying on task, waiting until the teacher calls on you, and resisting retaliation when they're provoked. So another part of executive function is working memory, holding information in mind while you're mentally working on it. This is involved in following multi-step instructions without reminders, managing transitions, remembering a story narrative from beginning to end, or social pretend play. This is painstakingly being developed during this period of time in which you're working with kids. And finally, mental flexibility, being able to switch perspective, attention, or mental focus. And these executive functions are relevant to children's ability to focus attention on what they're supposed to be focusing attention on in a classroom, to focus their thinking on a problem-solving task, but it's also relevant to their ability to control their emotions and to be socially competent. Let's just take a simple example that probably nobody here is familiar with. In the classroom, what happens when it's time to plan or to get ready for another activity? What has to happen? Well, first, kids have to finish their activity. They have to put things away, right? Then they have to return books and materials to shelves, put your project in your cubby or your desk, and then prepare for the next activity. What does this involve? Another set of sequence of steps. Get a different book from the appropriate shelf, find something to write with, go to where worksheets are and find yours, and then find your partner and decide on a workspace and figure out what you need to do. What does this involve? Inhibitory control, stop doing what you've been doing. It involves working memory. Why am I stopping doing what I'm doing? Oh yeah, we're doing something else. It involves mental flexibility. I can't find the worksheets here. Where else might they be? And why is it that it's often true that when we announce that it's time to switch to another activity, an inexperienced teacher turns her back, turns toward the kids a couple minutes later and is surprised to discover that half of them are ready for the next activity, a third of them are still doing what they were doing at the beginning, and the rest are wandering in between somewhere in the midst of all this, but having forgotten what they were doing in the first place. And for kids of this age, for kids in this pre-K to third grade transition to varying degrees, this is not because they're not cooperating or listening to you. It's because their brains are trying as hard as they can, but they're only developing. Why does this take so long? Well, here's one of the areas that is relevant in the brain to developing executive functions. The anterior cingulate was part of that prefrontal area that Sylvia Bunke talked about. This is the one that's relevant to inhibitory control. It helps people inhibit a dominant response. But look at the next line. It has an extended developmental timetable, beginning to develop roughly at 12 months and extending to age 25. I have 2 young adult sons. I think they're just about at the end of this process. Our children, the children you work with, are still taking their baby steps in this aspect of brain development. And therefore, what we need are classrooms that assist children with self-regulation, because the relationships are important in helping children use and extend what they're capable of, what these developing skills are, to help that poor anterior cingulate do what it can do as best as it can. And here are some of the characteristics of those classrooms that assist children in emotion regulation. I won't talk about all these, but let me just point out that when we guide children with do statements rather than don't statements, we enlist different areas of the brain as opposed to those that are relevant to inhibiting behavior. Easier for kids to follow do statements, walk slowly please, as opposed to don't statements, stop running. Okay? Very simple thing. Developmentally appropriate expectations, helping children anticipate transitions using words. Now, you all know that we tell children to use words when they're getting emotionally aroused. Use words, don't act out. But you know what? Words end up helping children focus their attention and their thinking in all sorts of situations. Using words while you're doing a science experiment. Using words while you're counting. Using words to repeat the narrative that your partner has just told you. Using words are a powerful self-regulatory device. And then enlisting peers in children's self-regulation through shared activity. Lots of things we do in our interactions with kids help that poor anterior cingulate. The question was raised in the video you saw of training executive function. Can we help children become perfect air traffic controllers of their own minds? No. Not if it takes 25 years for those brain areas to develop. But we can help children do as well as they're capable of by creating classrooms that they can manage with these skills at the point in their development. We also have to recognize individual differences in children's self-regulation. I know part of what you're thinking here is that you've got some kids in your classroom who are just wonderfully cooperative. They're always doing the right thing. They never have trouble following instructions. Why can't the rest of the kids be like her? But the fact is that there's also a temperament dimension called effortful control. And children vary temperamentally in their ability to deliberately control and manage their own impulses. That's why you get such wide individual differences. Does this make sense? Does this help you see children in that light? We no longer talk about kids at this age being egocentric, because we recognize that a lot of the things we used to call egocentric are really problems of self-regulation because of developing executive function rooted in the developing brain. Well, not surprisingly, all this has to do with how behavior management comes from the child with support from teachers and peers. And this leads us then to thinking about cooperation and responsibility. Because the other remarkable thing about this developmental period that we're focused on today is that children in the pre-K to third grade transition are developing the internal capacities for cooperation and responsibility. Early in the preschool years, we have to manage, we have to regulate their behavior for them because their brains have not developed that capacity for themselves. But as children are making their way through the end of the preschool years and the early grade school years, just as Janet and I see in Emma, they are developing these internal regulators that enable them to get along with others. What do these include? Respecting others' feelings and opinions. But not only that, being able to balance that with self-interest. By age 5 or so, children are much more capable of recognizing that a good solution when two kids want to use a tricycle is not, I will use it. They begin thinking about taking turns, recognizing that this other person also has an interest that I need to respect. Sharing responsibility for classroom management and procedures. The child who, when it's cleanup time or it's time to transition to something, is standing waiting for the next thing, where others are scurrying around going about the cleanup task. You ask them why they're not helping, and they're saying, because I didn't make that mess, right? In this transition, children are beginning to see themselves as sharing responsibility. For our classroom, it's our mess. We're doing this together. Children are capable of participating in group decision making, whether it has to do with making judgments about what to name the class pet or how to choose an activity, they're beginning to understand this process of listening to others' opinions, sharing your own point of view, and even the idea that the majority rules. Their memory for group rules and how they apply to oneself and others is growing as well. Remember, working memory is one of the challenges of executive functions. It's not that working memory grows as kids get older, it's that they become capable of using it better. And part of the skill here is having the rule in mind, but also being able to think about how it applies to what I'm doing as well as what other people are doing. That's a skill that's developing during this period. Enlisting conflict resolution strategies like compromise and turn-taking. And finally, self-regard, seeing oneself as a cooperative, positive member of the group, being able to think about my being a group citizen, not just on my own interests. Kids don't articulate that, but it is possible, and in fact we do in the third volume of the Preschool Learning Foundations, talk about the growth of citizenship. You don't think the kids are learning civics in your classrooms, but they actually are, as they're thinking about themselves as part of a group who has responsibilities to the group, not just to oneself. Relationships with teachers and peers therefore provide support and motivation for this kind of cooperative conduct. So our challenge, again, in the relationships we develop with kids and the classrooms we create for them is to help create classrooms that encourage cooperation and responsibility. And again, I won't go into these in great detail, but there are things that we can do to help children use these developing skills to see their own needs and desires in the context of other people, to take those other desires into account in order to advance the goals of the group, not just themselves, including how we help children understand other people, how we help them learn to express their own feelings in constructive ways as we model and encourage respect for different points of view in our own behavior, and as we have children explain to each other conflicting points of view, conflicting desires and demands. Again, behavior management comes from the child with support from teachers and peers. In the last couple of minutes, I want to turn to a topic that is particularly pertinent for us in California, given the wide socioeconomic variation that exists in the children that we work with and the different kinds of life circumstances they come from. How many of you work with kids that are stressed, that you can see signs of stress in their own behavior where you are? Okay. It's a topic that is attracting the attention of researchers now because of our recognition that with virtually half of children in the age group that we're looking at, children age 6, 7, and 8 and under, virtually half growing up either in poverty or in low-income families, with stress coming from other family and neighborhood circumstances that wear on children emotionally. We're now beginning to understand that stress can make a difference in terms of what they're doing in a classroom. And the bottom line here is what we're learning is that stress hormones triggered by moderate and severe stressors can affect many brain areas, including those that relate to learning, thinking, and memory, as well as those that have to do with emotional self-control. Sometimes this kind of stress is called toxic stress, and I'll turn to what that is in just a moment. But it causes their stress management systems to ramp up in circumstances where other kids would not get nearly so aroused. These are the children, therefore, who are often flying off the handle in response to a peer provocation that others would not be bothered by, who fall apart emotionally, perhaps when they're reprimanded by an adult. But these are also the kids, it turns out, who are having trouble focusing their attention in the classroom, who are forgetting the instructions they've just been told so they're not following them, who are not getting things done because they seem distracted and they don't seem like they're really concentrating on the task at hand. And the reason for that is because those same stress hormones that are causing their stress management systems to ramp up are also affecting parts of the brain that relate to memory and learning and thinking. And that's why children who are at greatest risk in these ways are often showing difficulties with poor attention, impulse control, and other reflections of these neurobiological effects. We need to define what we're talking about in terms of stress. And researchers often talk about 3 different kinds. There is what we actually call positive stress, and this consists of situations in which your heart rate, elevations of stress hormones are within manageable levels. You may not believe it, but there actually are positive stressors in our lives. And for children, they actually help to calibrate your stress system, give children active experiences of learning to cope. We wouldn't want them to grow out without experiences of positive stress. But they're manageable, they're controllable. There is what we call tolerable stress. These are more significant in severity, but the important characteristic of them is that they're buffered by supportive relationships. So a child, for example, who's had a frightening injury, but is immediately enveloped by the nurture and protection of an adult they trust, experiences that as tolerable because somebody's got your back. And in this respect, children aren't any different from the rest of us, are they? It makes a lot of difference knowing somebody's there with you when you're going through a tough time. And that's the difference between tolerable stress and what we call toxic stress, that is distinguished not just by how severe or how long it lasts, but the fact that you are doing it by yourself. And many of the stressors that children in our classrooms face are ones that we might consider to be toxic stress, because sometimes the stressors are coming from parents who are so anxious and depressed and overwhelmed by their own life circumstances that they're not available to their kids, or children who are living at homes with relentless domestic conflict, sometimes violence, where parents are themselves the sources of stress, and therefore there's nobody there to provide the backup protection that kids are needing. And you know who is available to them in those circumstances? Yeah, that's right. That's right. So the dilemma you have is that there may be nothing you can do to change a difficult family environment that children are coming from when they come to your classroom in the morning. But there is a lot you can do to give them an experience of an alternative, a different environment that is safe and predictable and child-centered. So that when children go into future relationships, when they move on into other environments, when they go on to other classrooms, they have not one model of how you interact with an adult, namely with vigilance for danger and threat. They have 2 models. There's that first model, and then there's the alternative model they've learned with you, that some adults can be trusted and provide security and safety. And that is a tremendous gift to be able to give to these children. So supportive teacher-child relationships are important in this respect because they provide a safe haven, they're reliable, even though they may be tested, because kids in these circumstances will try to figure out, okay, they're just pretending. They're not really going to be helpful when I push their buttons. And so you are having to show them that you are reliable. In these relationships, you assist in emotion regulation, encourage communication, support self-confidence. The looking glass self reflects how children see themselves through how you see them, and derive self-confidence because of your positive valuation of them, and can create bridges to other sources of assistance. We are having to think more about stress now because we're learning now that it not just affects children socially and emotionally, but it also affects how children learn. And if we can help to buffer that stress, if we can provide a social context in which children are safe and can turn their cognitive resources from vigilance to learning, we not only help them in the classroom, but we also give them tools for coping outside of the classroom. Thanks again for letting me be with you this morning.